my name's Ben Rees, and during this video I'll be talking about the methods and materials that I use to make combat-safe blunt arrows that are suitable for the use on the battlefields of Regia Anglorum. Before we get into it, I would just say please make sure you read the most up-to-date missiles regs, as although I'll be covering most of the key elements in this video, there'll be certain things in there that will help you and guide you in your constructions and in your acquiring of certain missile war gear. So, let's get to it. As with all weapons used on the battlefields of Regia Anglorum, missiles must conform to strict regulations. All combat arrows must be 32 inches in length and made from either Port Orford cedar or ramin. Other hardwoods are allowable, but check the regs for details. The blunts on the ends of the arrows, where traditionally the pointy bit goes, may be either red blunts or black blunts. No other types of blunts are allowable. And on the other end, we have our fletchings. Most arrows will have 3 fletchings on, although some Viking arrows will have 4 fletchings. Again, see the regs for more details. Key features to note are the nock where the arrow attaches to the bow and the particular size of the fletchings. Now, for us, we require all fletchings to be 3.5 inches in length, starting at 5/8 of an inch at the front, increasing to 1 inch at the back. Now, although those are the minimum specifications, I would advise making them slightly larger than that, because over time they will compress and get worn down, particularly with use and when they get wet and a bit dirty. You can see in this example that I have glued and whipped the arrow to the fletchings to make them stronger and hopefully last a little bit longer, but I'll go through how I do that later in the video. One final point to note is that when you are buying your fletchings, make sure you buy either right wing or left wing. Don't mix the two up. Because there is a curve to the feathers, and if you buy one of each, then the arrow won't fly correctly. So make sure they're all from the same wing. Right, let's have a look at the steps that I use during my construction process. So the first step is to take the dowel that you've bought and just check it over for any signs of damage. It's no good getting halfway through making the arrow to realise that it's actually not going to be safe for the battlefield. So quickly check up and down the length of the shaft, looking for any signs of delamination or any cracks. Give it a quick flex, listening again for any cracks or anything that would portray a weakness in the shaft. The next thing to do will be to oil the shaft, because most of them are supplied unoiled. And although this isn't a guarantee that it'll last longer, it certainly helps it be a little bit more durable and a little bit more resistant on the field. Once you've oiled your shaft, give it a couple of hours to allow the oil to really soak in. Wipe off any excess, and then you'd be ready to put on the blunt. Now, in this example, I've already done that, but to do that, just place the blunt over the very end of the arrow, find a flat, hard surface, and push. What you're looking for eventually is that the blunt does not move at the very end. If it's wiggling at the end, it isn't on fire enough, so just support the shaft and keep pushing until it no longer wiggles. At the other end of the arrow, you are now able to cut your nock. And you can do that either with manual tools, such as 2 hacksaw blades cut together, or using a method similar to what I use, where I take a Dremel with 2 cutting bits on the same bar and just cut into the wood. Now, as you can see from this image, make sure you cut across the grain, not with the grain. Again, it won't be foolproof to make it last longer, but if you cut it this way, it is much less likely to split, because there's an awful lot of force going through the arrow when it's knocked onto the bow and released from the bow. It doesn't need to be particularly deep, just deep enough so that you can comfortably get the string on. But if you're looking for measurements, mine are usually, and I say this roughly, about 3 millimeters wide by about 7 millimeters deep. Once I've cut those nocks, I'll use a file just to tidy up the edges and take off any stray bits of delaminating wood or splinters. To add more strength to the top of the arrow, I usually whip a couple of loops of thread around the top, just to prevent it from splitting apart. That holds it together tightly and prevents it from splitting when it's being used and released from the bow. So to whip your arrow, take a length of thread that is approximately the same length as 3/4 of the length of your arm and create a loop. Place the loop on the arrow just below the nock, ensuring that the loop at the top, the long length of thread and the short length of thread are freely accessible. Take the longer length of thread and begin to wrap it around the arrow, including over the top of the loop. The important thing at this point is to keep the tension on. You want it nice and tight so that it offers some real strength and real support to this section just below the nock. Do that a couple of times. It doesn't need to be too thick particularly, just enough to satisfy you that it'll give it some real strength to prevent the wood from splitting when released from the bow. Once you've done that a couple of times, take your long length of thread and put that through the loop that you've created at the top. Pull the shorter length of thread so that the loop begins to tighten and begins to pull the long length of thread through your new band of whipping. You don't want it to go all the way through. About halfway through will mean that it keeps its own tension and keeps itself tight. Don't worry, as in this example, if you pull it all the way through, you can just pull back on the top long bit of thread and that will pull your loop back underneath the area that you've just whipped. That is now nice and tight. All you've got to do is cut off the top and the bottom length, and that will keep its own tension, keep itself nice and tight. Each fletching needs to start 1.25 inches from the back of the arrow. Make the mark as discreet as you can, but it will be covered up later, so don't worry too much about it. Although it is not essential, I find using a fletching jig makes it much easier to more accurately place the fletchings onto the shaft of the arrow. They need to be evenly spaced at 120 degrees from each other. First thing to do is place the arrow into the jig and secure it on the nock end with an elastic band. I also use a small wooden tab to help me more accurately set the angle of the fletching. As it is really important to get it right, I always start with a cock feather. This needs to be placed at 90 degrees from the angle of the nock. Starting with a cock feather, which should be a different colour to the rest of your fletchings, in this example it's black, place the feather into the grips to be ready to be placed into the jig, ensuring that it's secure and tight and in line with the mark that I created earlier on the arrow. Using some fast setting 2-part glue, I put a little bit down the length of the fletching itself. Before putting that onto the frame, I will cover the arrow with the second part of the glue, which will cause it to dry very, very quickly. Push the grips with the fletching in down, count for a couple of seconds, spray quickly again with the second part of the adhesive, and remove the grips, and hopefully the fletching will stay on the arrow. Twisting the arrow to the second position using the marker at the back, repeat the process. As you can see now, all 3 fletchings are securely attached to the shaft of the arrow, and it's time to move on to the final step. Don't worry, these clips are actually sped up, as although this isn't overly complicated, it can take a little bit of time and be a little fiddly, and that would be really boring to watch. But the thing to do is place a little bit of the thread so that it points up the shaft of the arrow, and start to rotate the arrow with the thread going over the top of the bit that you've just placed on the shaft. Rotate the arrow a couple of times, you don't need this to be too thick, and then start to go through the feathers themselves, the fletchings. You can leave fairly large gaps between the threads that you place through the feathers, but the more you do it, the less it strains on the feathers and less it pulls them out of shape. And it looks a bit better. Now, once you get to the top, I'm sure there are other ways to do this, but I use a separate piece of thread. So as I did before, I create a loop and place that on the arrow, the loop heading up towards the nock so that it's out the way, and the 2 other bits of thread pointing down the arrow so they're also out the way. And I bind over the top of this bit of thread with the bit of thread that I'm whipping with. Again, not wanting to make it too thick, I just put it around the arrow a few times, and when I'm satisfied, I place that through the loop and just pull down on the 2 pieces of thread
If that gets a little bit tight, give it a little bit of a helping hand as I did there, but pull the thread all the way through. Then cut the excess off, and I add a little bit of impact adhesive, just a touch, to each of the areas that I've whipped to prevent them from becoming undone. Now they should stay with the tension that you put on them, but we play quite rough on occasion, so that helps even more. And there we have it, a completed fletched arrow. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget that most information can be found in the Missiles regs, but if you do get stuck, please don't hesitate to contact a member of the Missiles team, and we'll do what we can to help. Good luck with your future Missiles projects, and hopefully see you soon. Bye!